Well, the train station at Fort Edmonton Park is a Class 3 or Class 4 station. They don't really mean very much more than the size of the town that the stations serve. So the larger the town, the bigger the station, the higher the class. Some stations might be just a bench. Some may not even be a bench, but a place where the engineer knows to stop. A major transportation center like Edmonton would have a bigger station, and there would be a unique design for each of those big cities. There would be some differences among stations depending on the railway that established them. But for Canadian Northern, Canadian National stations, they generally tended to be white stucco. They had this kind of a look that you see here in a number of railway museums across the province. Now, one of the most important parts of a station is that big bay window we see at the top. And that's the place where someone at the station master, could be keeping an eye on what was happening on the grounds of the station, on the platform. So if there were grain elevators here, he'd be able to keep an eye on what's going on at the various elevators. There were a number of jobs attached to a station. The person in charge would be the station master, and often the station master lived in the station, if they were of a particular size, with his family. But also at the station would be people selling the tickets. There'd also be a telegraph operator. Train stations, all of the train companies maintained telegraph systems, and that was your way of getting a message across the country quickly. There would also be people handling the baggage, not only the baggage of the passengers who are taking train trips, but also all of the freight that would come into the town on the train. And if the station were large enough and in a center that was large enough, there would probably be a coffee shop, someplace to get a meal as you waited to change trains or make connections. The number of elevators that might be in a municipality would depend on the farming district around it. The grain belt, the really strong wheat country in southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, could have as many as a dozen or 15 elevators. The elevator is where the farmers would bring their grain to be evaluated. And so they would get a value for their crop. There would be deductions made for how wet the crop might be, or whether there was some alien seed mixed in with the grain. And then there needed to be a place to store the grain before it was sent by train. So that's what the elevator's main function was for. It would be a number of bins included in that tall structure that would then hold the grain purchased from various farmers. It's very representative of the kind of station that Canadian Northern, Canadian National built in the 1920s and into the 1930s and even into after the Second World War. It is not a depiction of an actual train station that existed in Edmonton. Edmonton had a number of different train stations. It never had one that looked exactly like this. But this is very representative of the kind of station that most Western Canadians would have seen if they were in a CN town. Canada went through an extraordinary railway boom in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. Huge amounts of rail were put down by Canadian Pacific, by Canadian Northern, by the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, and other railways in Eastern Canada. In the 1920s, particularly the heyday of rail travel in Canada, you had an extensive network where every part of Canada, generally speaking, except the north, was connected by rail. If you were in a small 100-person town somewhere in Alberta or Saskatchewan, you could buy your ticket to go all the way to England at your local station. So rail cannot be underestimated as the way most Canadians moved, both for leisure and for business. And so you would have business people riding the trains all the time as they would go from place to place. There was no highway system in Canada, and especially no highway system that connected all of the provinces. That had to wait until the end of the 1950s and the final completion of the Trans-Canada Highway in the early 1960s. So yes, you would have had a luggage room. You would have had places to actually store luggage. Luggage was put onto a separate car, so it would be assembled at the station. You'd retrieve it when you completed your journey. Or you'd have had the waiting room, certainly a place for you to sit and wait for your train to come. And if you're making a connection at a major intersection, that might be some hours, so there might also be a place for coffee and a sandwich as well. The news butchers might come in, and they might, as well as selling you a newspaper, have a wrapped sandwich that they might sell you. If the station was big enough, there'd actually be a separate waiting room for women, unaccompanied women or women with small children, where they could sit away from the general hubbub. Nowadays, we're used to train stations having only a handful of trains in a given week. But in those days, you would have had multiple trains a day at different times of the day. There's a constant variety of things that are going on in the train station. So those would be some of the rooms on the main floor. You'd also have the telegraph agent and certainly the ticket agent selling you tickets on to your next destination. Tourism was also being developed, especially here in the West and in Eastern Canada, around the national parks that were growing at that time. So also there would be people who were providing tours would be at the station to sell you a seat on their bus. So there would be other small entrepreneurial activities that would be associated with the station if it was in a particular place. Nowadays, we tend to dress for comfort, to travel, and especially the longer the distance, the more casual we are. In the 1920s, in particular, you would have seen people dress up to ride the train. So even if it's an hour trip into the city, the ladies and the children that would be traveling would be wearing their best clothes. Men would all wear suits. Even if they were laborers, they would probably wear a suit if they were on a holiday and traveling. Traveling was considered to be a more formal public expression of yourself. And so you tended to get many travelers who would be dressed up for the occasion. The trains would be traveling, and especially long distance trains, traveling through the day. If you had a station stop at a major station in the city, there would be the newsies, as they were called, newsboys and young girls selling newspapers, and they'd be selling the latest editions. So if you were traveling from city to city, you could actually follow the development of a news story by getting a newspaper in each of the cities, a later edition which would have the updates to the story. There would also be books that might be for sale. There might even be charities that would provide books for travelers at the station. It's interesting to think that actually radio in Canada got its start because of the trains. So radio actually owes a lot in Canada to the train systems. By the 1920s, the rail network had matured. As we've already talked about, it was the most common way for people to do distance travel. The railway companies, because this was their golden age, they spent a lot of time making the dining experience on the dining car for the sleeping car passengers or first class passengers into a real experience. In those days, you would have sat in a restaurant dining car and you would be seated at a table with white linen tablecloths, with fine china, with silverware, real silver, with crystal glass, where they would serve you your drinks, your water, your wine, and you would have a menu, just like a fine restaurant in the big city, that would give you various options of what you might eat while you're on the dining car. You would also have different seatings. And so there would be someone go through the train prior to a mealtime, and they would assign people first, second, or third seating for lunch or for dinner.